Peter's confession, decisive turning point. Dawn breaks over first-century Galilee, a region in turmoil, a crossroads of cultures and tensions. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish people are torn between different religious and political currents. The Pharisees advocate strict observance of the law, the Sadducees collaborate with Roman power, the Zealots dream of armed revolt. And in the midst of this complex landscape, an itinerant preacher named Jesus is attracting more and more attention. For nearly 3 years, Jesus has been traveling through towns and villages, teaching in synagogues, healing the sick, multiplying signs that, for many, evoke the arrival of the long-awaited Messiah. But who is he really? Rumors are rife. Some see him as a new prophet, others as a troublemaker, still others as the liberator who will drive out the Romans. It's in this charged context that the episode we're going to explore today unfolds. Peter's confession, a moment that will mark a decisive turning point in Jesus' ministry and in the disciples' understanding of his identity. Let's imagine the scene. Jesus and his disciples have just arrived in the region of Caesarea Philippi, a city located at the foot of Mount Hermon, on the northern border of Galilee. It's a place steeped in history and religious symbolism. For centuries, this site has been associated with the worship of various pagan deities. A large temple dedicated to the god Pan stands there, reminding of the presence of Greek and Roman cultures. Jesus' choice of this location is not insignificant. Caesarea Philippi, with its mix of cultures and religions, offers a perfect setting for a revelation that will transcend traditional Jewish expectations concerning the Messiah. It's here, on the border between the Jewish and pagan worlds, that Jesus will ask a question that will change everything. The group has stopped to rest. The atmosphere is calm, conducive to reflection. Jesus looks at his disciples, these men who have been following him for months, who have left everything to follow him. Peter, James, John, Andrew, and the others are there, waiting for their master's words. They have seen Jesus perform extraordinary miracles. They have heard him teach with an authority that surpassed that of the scribes. But do they really understand who he is? Jesus speaks up. Who do people say the Son of Man is? This question is not trivial. The expression Son of Man is loaded with meaning in Jewish tradition. It refers to a mysterious figure mentioned in the book of Daniel, a heavenly figure to whom God gives dominion, glory, and kingship over all peoples. By using this title, Jesus is already alluding to his divine identity, while inviting his disciples to express what they have understood. The disciples begin to respond, reporting the various opinions they have heard. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. These answers reflect the messianic expectations of the time. John the Baptist was seen as the forerunner of the Messiah. His powerful preaching and call to repentance had made a strong impression. Some thought Jesus might be John the Baptist resurrected, continuing his ministry with renewed power. Elijah, for his part, held a special place in Jewish expectations. The prophet Malachi had announced that Elijah would return before the day of the Lord. Many were therefore awaiting the return of this powerful prophet who had challenged false gods and called the people back to the true God. Jeremiah, nicknamed the Weeping Prophet, was associated with messianic prophecies. His compassion for the people and his warnings about coming judgment resonated with Jesus' message. All these identifications place Jesus in the lineage of Israel's great prophets, but don't go so far as to recognize him as the Messiah himself. They testify to the profound impact of Jesus' ministry while revealing the limits of popular understanding. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He then asks a more direct, more personal question. But what about you? Who do you say I am? Silence falls over the group. The disciples exchange hesitant glances. This question forces them to go beyond rumors and speculations. Jesus invites them to express their own understanding, fruit of months spent at his side, observing his actions, listening to his teachings. Who will dare to answer? Who will put into words what they're all beginning to suspect but don't yet dare to formulate? It's then that Simon Peter, impulsive as usual, speaks up. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. These words resound like a clap of thunder. Peter has just taken a decisive step. He's not content to repeat popular opinions. He doesn't simply see Jesus as a prophet or a teacher. He recognizes him as the Messiah, Christ in Greek, God's anointed one expected for centuries to liberate and restore Israel. But Peter goes even further. By declaring Jesus Son of the living God, he expresses an understanding that goes beyond traditional messianic expectations. This statement suggests a unique relationship between Jesus and God, an identity that goes beyond the role of king or prophet. Jesus' reaction is as surprising as Peter's declaration. "Blessed are you, Simon son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Jesus thus confirms the accuracy of Peter's confession, while emphasizing that it doesn't come from mere human deduction, but from divine revelation. It's a moment of capital importance. For the first time, Jesus' true identity is clearly proclaimed by one of his disciples. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He continues, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." These words are loaded with meaning and have been the subject of numerous interpretations throughout church history. Jesus plays on Simon's name, which he previously nicknamed Peter, Kephas in Aramaic, Petros in Greek, meaning rock. He declares that on this rock, whether it's Peter himself or his confession of faith, he will build his church. The use of the term church, ekklesia in Greek, is significant. It's the first time this word appears in the Gospels. It designates an assembly, a community of believers, distinct from the Jewish synagogue. Jesus thus announces the formation of a new community of faith, based on the recognition of his messianic and divine identity. The promise that the gates of Hades will not overcome it is an assurance of this church's ultimate victory over the forces of evil and death. As for the keys of the kingdom and the power to bind and loose, they refer to the spiritual authority entrusted to Peter and, by extension, to the church. Peter's confession marks a turning point in Jesus' ministry. From this moment on, he begins to speak openly about his coming passion. The Gospel of Matthew tells us, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." This announcement deeply shocks the disciples, especially Peter. The idea of a suffering and dying Messiah is in total contradiction with the expectations of the time. The Messiah was supposed to be a conquering king who would liberate Israel from Roman oppression, not a sacrificial victim. Peter, who has just confessed Jesus as the Christ, cannot accept this prospect. He takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. "Never, Lord. This shall never happen to you." Jesus' reaction is severe. "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." This passage illustrates the difficulty, even for Jesus' closest disciples, of fully understanding the nature of his mission. Peter's confession, although correct, doesn't imply a complete understanding of what it means to be the Messiah according to God's plan. Peter's confession is a key moment in the progressive revelation of Jesus' identity in the gospel. It marks the transition between the Galilean phase of Jesus' ministry, characterized by teachings and miracles, and the march towards Jerusalem that will culminate in his passion, death, and resurrection. This confession affirms several important theological truths. Jesus' messianic identity. By recognizing him as the Christ, Peter confirms that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the promised Messiah. Jesus' divinity. The affirmation Son of the living God goes beyond mere messianic recognition and suggests a unique relationship between Jesus and God. The nature of the church. Jesus' words to Peter lay the foundations of Christian ecclesiology, defining the church as a community founded on the confession of faith in Jesus as Christ and Son of God. Apostolic authority. The gift of the keys of the kingdom to Peter establishes the principle of spiritual authority in the church, a concept that will have important implications in the development of Christianity. The nature of revelation. Jesus emphasizes that the understanding of his identity is not the result of mere human deduction, but of divine revelation. Peter's confession and Jesus' subsequent words have been the subject of numerous theological debates throughout church history. The traditional Roman Catholic interpretation sees in this passage the scriptural basis for Peter's primacy and, by extension, the papacy. According to this view, Jesus establishes Peter as the visible foundation of the Church and confers on him a unique authority that is transmitted to his successors, bishops of Rome. Protestant and Orthodox traditions have generally interpreted this passage differently. For many, the rock on which the Church is built is not Peter himself, but his confession of faith. The emphasis is placed on the content of the confession rather than on Peter's person. These different interpretations have played an important role in ecclesiastical divisions throughout history, particularly during the Protestant Reformation. Despite these historical debates, Peter's confession remains a passage of great relevance for believers today. It invites us to personal reflection on our own understanding of Jesus' identity. Who do we say he is? How does our answer to this question affect our lives? Peter's confession also reminds us that true faith is not simply an intellectual adherence to doctrines, but a personal revelation that transforms our life. Like Peter, we are called to move from general opinions about Jesus to a personal recognition of his identity and authority. Finally, this passage invites us to reflect on the nature of the Church. What defines the true Church of Jesus Christ? How can we contribute to building a community of faith that resists the gates of Hades? The announcement of the Passion that immediately follows Peter's confession reminds us that recognizing Jesus as the Christ is only the beginning of the path of faith. The real challenge is to follow him on the way of the cross. Jesus says to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." These words invite us to deep reflection on what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. They remind us that the Christian faith is not an easy or comfortable path, but a call to radical commitment. The self-denial Jesus speaks of doesn't mean a negation of our personality or individuality. Rather, it's about putting God and his kingdom at the center of our life, rather than our own desires or ambitions. Taking up one's cross evokes the idea of facing the challenges and sufferings that may result from our commitment to Christ. In the context of the time, the cross was a symbol of shame and death. By using this image, Jesus prepares his disciples for the possibility of persecution and rejection. Paradoxically, Jesus affirms that it's in losing one's life for him that one truly finds it. This idea of dying to self to find true life is a central theme of Jesus' teaching. It suggests that it's in giving ourselves fully to God and others that we discover our true identity and true purpose. Peter's confession marks the beginning of a process of transformation for this impetuous apostle. Although he correctly identified Jesus as the Christ, Peter still has much to learn about what this truly means. We see Peter struggle with this understanding throughout the Gospels. At the Last Supper, he confidently declares that he will never abandon Jesus, even if everyone else does. Yet a few hours later, he denies his master 3 times. After Jesus' resurrection, we see a transformed Peter. In the book of Acts, he preaches boldly, confronting the same authorities who condemned Jesus. Tradition tells us that he eventually gave his life for his faith, asking to be crucified upside down, not considering himself worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Peter's story reminds us that spiritual growth is a process. Confession of faith is only the beginning. It must be followed by a life of discipleship, marked by continuous learning, occasional failures, and constant dependence on God's grace.